Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome back, listeners. We have a special guest this week, Gyimah, and she is joining us from the other side of the pond. It's always nice when we have guests outside of the U.S. that can give us a more global context. So I'm excited for that. And Michelle is the director of Equality Pays, a gender and ethnicity equality consultancy. And she's dedicated on closing those pesky workplace pay gaps. With gender pay gap reporting regulation, and possible ethnicity pay gap reporting, and a workplace talent shortage looming. Yes, still looming. Redressing gender and racial inequalities in the workplace is more important now than ever. She has a unique understanding of employee engagement, workplace challenges, and personal experiences that enabled her embed practical application into her consultancy. She's also passionate about enabling women and men to progress in their careers in the way that suits outside work responsibilities and lifestyle choices. She does this by empowering workplaces to radically rethink how they support their employees. And she has over 8 years of experience at working at the Equality and Human Rights Commission and holds a master's in human rights from the University of Manchester. Oh, I'm so excited to have you on, Michelle.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Well, I know out of all the episodes I have recorded here, now nearing 200, we have not had a dedicated episode to something as important as pay equity. And so I would love, Michelle, for you first to share your story, of how you got into this work. How does one go into pay equity work? And then maybe we'll spend some time just kind of talking about what that looks like practically inside organizations. But start off with your story. I'd love to hear how you got into this.
Yeah, it's funny because when I get asked that question, the short answer is always by accident. I don't think there are many people that are like, I know what I want to be when I grow up, pay equity consultant. Um, so yeah, I basically started my kind of proper career, as it were, at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So that's like a body in the UK that's independent of government, and they provide advice for employers, government as well, and educational establishments and goods and services providers on all things to do with the Equality Act and Human Rights Act. And so the team that I worked in was actually the equal pay team. And it's really funny because when I went for the interview, I had never even heard of equal pay. I didn't know anything about it, but I was just a bit like, this looks interesting. I think I could do it. And I actually got the job. So I was learning on the job. So my role essentially was to work with employers to help them understand what equal pay was and wasn't, and obviously that it's related to pay gaps, so it's not exactly the same. And so I would write guidance and kind of give talks and support employers with that work. And it was a real eye opener for me because I could see through doing that work times where I'd either been asked like inappropriate questions at work, or I'd been passed over for promotion, or I didn't get as much of a pay rise as my predecessor, etc. And back then, in kind of like the early days of my career, I didn't know that those things were wrong, or I might have had an inkling, but I didn't have the confidence or the language to be able to kind of challenge it. And so doing this work made me realize, oh, actually, I have had quite a bit of this experience before. This has happened to me before. So I really enjoyed that work. But there came a point where I wanted to do much more hands-on work because at the commission, I couldn't work with individual employers. It was very much providing guidance, giving talks, and then kind of saying to companies, right, I've written the guidance for you. You've come to the talk. I've answered your questions. You need to kind of go and implement it. But I wanted to be more hands-on, and so when did I become a freelancer? When I was actually on maternity leave with my first baby, I decided to set up my own business. So I took voluntary redundancy, set up Equality Pays, and yeah, just kind of put myself in the business for anything to do with, closing pay gaps in the workplace. And it was interesting because I was always that type of person. Like as soon as I told them told people what I did, like if I was at a conference or an event or something, I could see people like physically trying to move away because they didn't want to have
Right.
a conversation, yeah,
I'm in trouble.
about pay gaps, yeah, or equal pay. And I'd be like, I'm really nice, really, honestly, but I just this is what I do. But since 2017 in the UK, we've had gender pay gap reporting. So that's where companies of a certain size, so 250 people or more, they have to publicly report on their gender pay gap every year, and it's every April. So it's usually the date's usually between like the 4th and the 6th of April. So since that time, I have become a little bit more popular, because companies are like, oh, we have to publish this data every year, and it's either not looking good or it's getting worse, or there's public pressure to come up with answers and solutions as to why they have such big pay gaps. So I'm pleased to say I'm not as unpopular as I used to be when I first started out
Well, that's
ago.
an interesting point that's happened in the years since you started your consultancy, which I can totally relate to starting a business with a little one because my baby was about one when I started my business too. I think there's something about motherhood and little people that inspire you to want better futures for them and not wait around for it and do something about it yourself. So I appreciate that part of your story. But a lot has changed with regulations and required reporting. I mean, even here in the United States, I think it gives us some optimism, although it looks like it's kind of state by state at this point, and the states that usually step first are. But I'm curious, Michelle, what are you seeing globally as far as a trend with reporting and reporting on those pay gaps?
Yeah, it's funny that. Yeah, I think it's I'm seeing an uptick, and here's the thing, like when it comes to issues around regulations to do with pay, when you see that end result of, oh, X state has decided that pay transparency is now mandatory, what you don't see is all of the years of work that's gone on behind the scenes to get to this stage. And so at the moment, if you don't know anything about pay equity, closing pay gaps, or pay transparency, it might seem like these issues are suddenly popping up. So in UK we have gender pay gap reporting. I think in Ireland they have it now as well. And then obviously you've got several states, so New York, California, Colorado, a few different states that have some form of pay transparency. And also the EU, it looks like they're going to be putting something forward. I think it's 2024, for companies that that are in the EU, and quite small companies as well, will need to show much more evidence around how they're ensuring that they're providing equal pay and closing the pay gap. So you might think, oh my goodness, this popping up left, right, and center. But this is work that's obviously been in progress behind the scenes, and none of these things come up overnight, but it's years and years of work from different agencies and different players, all the way from one man band or one woman band consultancies, all the way through to big institutions who are lobbying to try and bring these things to the forefront, because equality matters. And the issue of pay, a lot of people will see it as an economic justice issue, that how can we talk about being progressive, companies or even organizations that champion gender equality, if one of the most basic aspects around equal pay and closing the pay gap is something that evades so many of us. So I am seeing that trend. I mean, I haven't mentioned anything about kind of Southeast Asian countries, or Australia or anything, but because I don't know much about what happens there. But I do on my LinkedIn start to see much more conversation about pay gaps, in those parts of the world as well. So for me, it's something that is here to stay. I think it's been an issue and a problem for many, many years, but we're kind of reaching that critical point where if companies are not doing this voluntarily, institutions and states and countries are stepping in to say, right, here is the benchmark of the minimum of what we expect, and we expect to see you take action and make improvements here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that. I mean, it's not a new trend, but I think it's starting to get people's attention more, especially here in the United States, when NASDAQ and some other organizations are starting to require representation filings, which, are different, but still there's an increased level of accountability that comes with representation. And then in pay is obviously another issue that has to be addressed alongside that. So curious, Michelle. So it's one thing to get the data, it's another thing to do something with the data. I'm curious, what do you see organizations do once they have reported their pay gaps? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I presume most organizations have a pay gap when it comes to gender and like you said, if you can measure ethnicity differences and things, but for the most part, it's gender. You're saying a pay gap. I mean, what do they do?
Yeah, and again, I find all this fascinating. So I'm going to say the word interesting a lot. Some people may not find this interesting, but I do. But, for us in the UK, when the first pay gap reports came out, it was almost a bit like titillation, like, oh, we can look at everyone's, interesting data that have been hidden for so long. But I think there was a real surprise for a lot of people who are not in this space, a real surprise that every single sector had a gender pay gap. And I think it was a bit of a shock for a lot of people because we have this assumption, particularly, here in the West, that we've got good rights, we've got good gender equality. Women are allowed, and I'm doing air quotes here, allowed in the workplace, and we have female managers and CEOs, and we have the right to vote, etc. So everything is okay. And then suddenly this pay gap information revealed that actually there are a lot of structural problems, within many companies, within many sectors, looking at the UK, and I'd imagine that it's the same for a lot of organizations globally as well. And so, there have been a number of responses to, the data that's been put out. So some companies will have just seen this as purely as a compliance exercise, very much something that needs to be done so that they're not, publicly named and shamed, or there's no other repercussions. And, a statement's put out, here's our data, the data is correct, and we'll be looking at what we can do to make things better. But then the kind of commitment stops there. And then you have other organizations who will kind of go into panic mode because their numbers are really high, or they're high for their sector, and they start kind of comparing themselves to other people, like, oh, we've got to do something about this. And you see that kind of top down pressure. And then, companies are looking, okay, what's the quickest thing that I can do? So I used to get that a lot in the early days. I don't get that so much now. And I think
What's
part of
the
that is
magic
the
wand?
education piece.
One thing I
Yes,
can do.
yes. Quick wins was the thing that came, the phrase that always used to come to mind. And I would like inwardly roll my eyes. I don't get that so much now. But that was very much that knee-jerk reaction. It might be because data is really bad, and a journalist or a newspaper wants to run a story about how terrible you are. So they go into panic mode. They're like, right, what's the thing that we can do so that we're not in this position this time next year? And so we'd see companies scrambling to, I wouldn't say necessarily, well, some companies might look to massage the figures, but more scrambling to make themselves look great without really addressing the root problems. And sometimes that would be a case of literally just promoting a couple of women into senior roles, because depending on the makeup of your company, just that alone can have a big impact. The problem with that, though, is that doesn't address the root problems, and it's not sustainable, and it's also not fair to kind of pin closing the pay gap on three women in the company, and they kind of feel like held to ransom, like, or they can't leave or move on or do something different because otherwise they'd bring the pay gap down. So that was one thing. That was another thing that I would see companies doing, looking for that real quick win. What can we do? And then you have other companies who might be a bit confused about the figure, but understand that there's a deeper level of work to be done here. And so what I'm starting to see now is companies that will have tried a few things over the years, and maybe their pay gap hasn't shifted. I mean, we can't talk about this conversation without acknowledging the impact that the global pandemic has had on people's lives, and the workforce, and how we approach work and do work, etc. And so for a lot of companies, yeah, their pay gap will have stagnated and or got worse, especially as we know so many women have left the workforce for, for a myriad of reasons kind of during the global pandemic. But there is this understanding that actually, when it comes to doing pay gap work, knowing the data is useful, but it's really about understanding the DNA and the culture of your organization. So, yes, you can have aspirations to close your pay gap by X% by X date, but really, companies might be saying, actually, we know that we are not nurturing our talent enough. And we know that, for example, women leave after their first baby or second baby. So we're going to concentrate on retaining our talent and ensuring that when somebody's going through that life change, rather than them leaving the workplace as being the only option for them, what can we do to help them stay? So it's about, having that kind of having like more of a mature outlook on pay gap reporting and understanding, okay, yes, we can look at the figure, but what else can we be looking at in our companies that means that we're taking the right actions and that we're looking at our culture. So it's, not just looking at the hard data and focusing just on that, but looking at the culture of our organization. What's the narrative? What's the story behind, who we are and how we do things? Like, what do we want people to say about us as a company when we're not in the room? So, it's that kind of journey from, from compliance to knee-jerk reaction to that mature understanding of what you can do with the data and how you should interpret it to help you
Yeah.
decide what you do.
I love that example of retaining women, especially after the first child or in the childbearing years. I mean, if you have data that you can break apart by different areas, I mean, you can get a bit more granular with where the real problems are happening. And I love what you said about addressing real root causes, because it's not, the knee jerk quick win is like, oh, women just don't want to be promoted, or women, don't have as much flexibility to work, these types of jobs. That's not usually the issue. It's like you said, it's the culture that's been created and nurtured over time to support those beliefs that lead women to feel like that's not a place where I belong or where I can achieve career success. So I'm going to do so elsewhere. And when you really peel back the onion and look at the real issues, you can solve more systemic issues. Michelle, I'm curious, once organizations have the data and they've moved into the mature phase, not the quick win, knee-jerk reaction phase, what kind of questions should they be asking of their employees? Because, I think quantitative data is important, but as like that doesn't tell the full story. There's usually qualitative, data that you can explore in focus groups or listening sessions or just, everyday interactions, collect some of that data too. I'm curious what that looks like in the exploring kind of the so what into the data. How do organizations do that?
Yeah, and I think it's really about, people's career experiences and career journey, like, trying to delve into, what is it like to be an employee at X company? And then, if you are in a position where you can add that added lens of what's it like to be a Black woman in X company, or what's it like to be an Asian man in X company, you can get some real juicy is not the word, it's not the right word, but you can get some real, additional layered information as to the different experiences that people have. And I think this is what gets forgotten, because there's so much focus on, well, we have a system and we have a process. But, if you're serious about kind of embedding, inclusion and equity into your workplace, you have to understand, well, what are the outcomes for people based on different characteristics if you apply the same system and process. So what works for somebody who is, able-bodied and, I don't know, has a specific, education background and degree, etc., may not necessarily work for somebody who has, aspects that are completely different. I remember I was talking to one potential client, and they work in the real estate sector, and they had done some work around their gender pay gap, and they had won lots of awards and issues to do with gender equality, etc. But they tried to start gathering data around, ethnicity. So wanted to know basically, how many people that they had from ethnic minority backgrounds and trying to get some, information about their experience. And the return rates on, those surveys and questionnaires were really low. And they came to me because they were completely baffled and they were saying, we don't understand why. We've won all these awards to do with gender, we've got all these great groups and, we kind of basically get pats on the back for how great we are as an organization. Why will people not even share what their ethnicity with us is? So I had to, had to tell them, then, that says a lot about the organization. And it says that even though you might be great at gender, you obviously have some issues to do with race in the company, and your people don't feel safe sharing that information. So you need to be kind of asking yourself, well, why is that, and looking into that. And that was a real shock for them. So, this is why I think the whole kind of single narrative or single story that you kind of carry about your company can be quite dangerous, because there may be other issues that are masked behind that. And so
Mhm.
as a company, once you have some data, or all your data, you need to be delving in, okay, but what does this mean for us? And are we gathering all of the stories and all of the voices, from our colleagues and our teams, etc. Who's not being included in this? Because that's where you're going to have the real learning around what needs to change in your culture and organization.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. It's that fear factor. If people don't even want to talk about their different experiences, if they're from a different ethnicity, that says a lot about the psychological safety or lack thereof in the organization. Without being able to address a problem or acknowledge a problem, how would you ever solve the problem? It reminds me, Michelle, I have a client right now, diversity committee that just started. I don't know, maybe they're 6 months in and kind of just they're in a wait and see approach. And it's in the oil and gas industry. Not that that matters, because, like you said, all industries have their issues, but this
Yes.
one's been historically pretty white male dominated for quite some time. Um, and we have somebody on the committee of color, and there's an unwillingness to address racism, that it doesn't exist here. And I find that just so deeply interesting, because I think there's a desire to want to believe that, like, nope, not a problem here. I've worked here. I've succeeded on my own merit. I don't want to be called attention to for being a part of another group. And I see women do this too. Like, just leave me alone. Like, don't bring attention to my gender. I just want to get my work done. And it's so hard to solve these systemic issues when we want to kind of bury the issue and not address it. I wonder, for your work in pay gaps, I mean, do you see that happen, like a denial, like when they even get the data of like, no, that's not true here. One I love that people, I don't love, air quotes love, that people say is like, um, oh, well, it's because, men are in higher level roles, that they get paid more. And it's like, I know the data gets sliced and diced different ways, so you can tell that story. And if that story is true, that's reflective of most corporate environments globally. But I'm curious, like, if you hear people kind of deny the issue, how do you help them see that it is an issue and it's not a zero-sum game? Like, if we address this, we all get better, right?
Yeah, it's the whole thing of, people thinking that there's one pie. And so if more people are invited to the table, that means everyone gets gets a smaller piece of pie, or some people don't go without. Yeah, it's an age-old conundrum, and I do see it in pay gaps world, in terms of having conversations with people, and the first thing they'll say is that we pay everyone fairly. Men and women here get the same pay, and I'll say, okay, well, that's equal pay, which is different to gender pay gap. So there's that. But then my next question is always like, oh, how do you know? And they'll be like, oh, we just know. And I'll be like, but like how? Like, have you done an equal pay audit? No. When was the last time that you've done one? Oh, we've never done one. So then I'll circle back to, so how do you actually know? And then you can see the kind of blank faces, because they realize actually they don't have the data to back up that statement. And I'm not asking that question to be difficult or to make them look, stupid or anything, but to just be factual. Because if you claim not to have a pay gap, if you claim to, provide equal pay, if you claim that there's no racism or sexism, misogyny or ableism or whatever the issue is, the next logical question is people's going to say, well, how do you know? And so you need to have that data. And the thing that I always say to, organizations is that, when you're making a business decision in your company, especially if it involves money, you always want to have the data, and you want to ensure that that data is factually correct before you go and make any big financial decision. This work is no different. So if you're going to say we pay everybody equally, the next thing should be, and we know this because our last equal pay audit showed us that we did. Or we did our equal pay audit and we found some discrepancies and we rectified them going forward. That is the full answer. If you're going to say there's no racism here, then you need to be able to say, and we know this because, we've done a survey, we've spoken to people and we've given them the opportunity to provide us the information anonymously. And what we found was we had problems in this area and we are working on it, or we fixed it, or whatever the answer is. But just saying that doesn't exist here is unsatisfactory. And we also don't know if it's true. And I think you're right. It's more of a case of just hoping that that will be enough for you to stop asking questions and to be able to move on, to something else. But it's very much that thing, just because you don't think it's an issue doesn't mean that it isn't. And it also doesn't mean that it's not impacting your business in a negative way. It might just be that you will find out too late, when it's too late for you to do something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And just because it's not happening to you doesn't mean it's not happening to someone else too. I love that. I love that question though. And we know this because I feel like that's a very kind way to invite somebody to share data, because they may have data, they may have, a focus group or something where they've learned a tidbit, and it might not just be based on their own information, but you're inviting them to share that before saying, no, it is, rather than just shoot them down,
Yes.
which tends to not go so well for a productive conversation. I love that, Michelle. I wonder, as we're wrapping up the year and, starting for 2023, and there's Equal Pay Day here in the States is in April. I know you mentioned some reporting that happens in the springtime. For organizations that might be thinking about that, preparing for the pay gap conversation or the reporting that they want to do or do. What are some tips? Like, what are some things that you would hope that they kept in mind as they go into this year's reporting cycle?
Yeah, the biggest thing for me is understanding your why and your purpose. So, obviously for the for UK companies, it's a legal compliance thing. But, beyond that, like why are you doing this work, and more importantly, what are you doing with this information beyond that? Because I know for us in the UK, we are past the point of that kind of data being like really big news for us. It was big news because in its early days, because this data was just never shared, and it was kind of exciting and interesting, and you did pour all over the data, and you were comparing, one company to another. But now it's like, like I said, it's that mature thing of, okay, what does it actually mean? So, you can have two companies that have, the similar sector, same business model, very similar pay gap. But what does it mean internally? And I think that's what people want to know. So what does it actually mean within the company? Does it mean that are you not recruiting enough women into the organization? Are they leaving at a certain point? Are they making it into senior leadership roles, but then they always, leave after 2 years? Like, what is actually happening? And this is where you'll better understand, the culture of your organization. So I think more about telling the story of why you have the pay gaps that you have, and then what you're actually planning to do, and also sharing, some of the lessons that you've learned over the years is really powerful. I think we are kind of beyond that whole, well, I haven't seen progress in the last 5 years, so you must be a terrible company to work for. I think we're beyond that, and we're in a space of, okay, well, I know that this is what you've been trying, and I know that change can be slow, but I trust you. I trust that you are doing the right thing. And I know that because you've shared that information in your pay gap report, or you talk about it regularly on social media, or, whatever it is that the organization does. I think it's having that transparency of, your pay gap journey. People appreciate that honesty. Even if you're not getting it right or you've made mistakes, if you can hold your hands up and say, well, we tried this and it didn't work, and so we have learned that that's not the way forward for us. We're going to do X. I think that goes a long way, because
Yeah,
people, that's what people
transparency.
are really interested. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're not really interested in what other people earn. They don't really care like how you compared to others, as long as you give a narrative around what you are doing, because they're placing themselves there, saying, okay, I'm in this workplace and the pay gap is X. How does that impact me now? And is this somewhere I want to stay? And, if you want to influence that decision, positively, then you've got to be prepared to discuss what you're actually doing, rather than just putting out a report every year and hoping that, either people don't read it or that they don't ask many questions. So I think being very clear on your purpose, very clear on your transparency, and obviously you don't have to share everything, but sharing something will be super useful, because in the absence of that information, people make their own assumptions, and those assumptions may be right, they may not be, but those assumptions could lead to them deciding to go elsewhere, and then you'll have a real retention problem. And you
Right.
know obviously that costs you more money, and half of these things could be avoidable if you had more transparency around what you're actually doing, when it comes to issues around closing pay gaps. So I think being very clear on purpose and transparency is going to be a big thing,
Yep.
and that'll be a big thing for new states that are having to deal with pay transparency, in the states as well, because people are going to have questions, say, right, okay, this is the first time we've got this information, and you now put in salaries on job adverts, and I don't, that doesn't match up with what I have. So I want to have a conversation about it. So again, have to be prepared for, what are going to be the frequently asked questions. But the biggest one is going to be, if there are discrepancies, how are you fixing it? That is the thing that people will want to know the most. So it's
Yep.
about being prepared for what's coming.
Yep. Yeah, I'm hearing being proactive, being vulnerable when you get it wrong, being transparent about what you are doing and not trying to hide things or tell a jaded story. Just be honest, be real. And the one caveat here, I'm noticing here in the States and globally, young people are asking these questions a lot more in the interview process and the screening processes. They're looking for organizations that are reporting on their pay gaps, that are talking actively about these things. So this conversation may feel new to some, but I think it's one that's just beginning, and that we'll continue to have. And we're not going to solve the problem overnight, but I love what you said about just trying different strategies, seeing what works, peel back the data, find the issues, and try to address them, strategically, just like you would in any other part of your business. Uh,
Exactly.
Michelle, it's been wonderful to be with you today. Tell our listeners, how can they follow your work and stay in touch with you?
Yeah, so my favorite place to hang out, on the internet is LinkedIn. So you can just look for me under my name, Michelle Gyimah. I'm on there most days, talking all things pay gaps, um, pay transparency, etc. Yeah, so that's the best place, where
Awesome.
you.
We'll link to
Oh, and I
that.
also have a podcast. How could I forget to mention that? Yes, I also have a podcast. At the moment, it's going through a bit of a revamp. So I'm changing the name actually. So at the moment it's called Better Money Conversations. So it's all about kind of peeling back the layers and the kind of mystique around pay gap issues, for HR managers and HR directors. But my second series is going to be coming out in 2023 under a new name. So you can follow me now on Better Money Conversations, and then I will be letting everybody know when the second series with the new name and new branding comes out soon.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, we'll link to that, the current link in the show notes. And Michelle, it's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Julie. This has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you are on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our brand new Lead Like an Ally online program, or get a copy of our new book, Allyship in Action, available on Amazon. Both are helpful tools that meet leaders where they're at and help provide tools for professional and personal settings. Head over to nextpivotpoint.com to get started today.